everyone, and welcome to another episode of Science Factory. Today, we have with us Kara Cooney, a very important Egyptologist. Unfortunately, is sick. So I hope we all wish her a speedy recovery. Although it's that time of the year when everybody gets sick. So I guess we just have to accept it and deal with it as good as we can. And welcome, first of all, Kara Cooney.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So Kara Cooney is a professor of ancient Egyptian art and architecture and chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Los Angeles, specializing in social history, gender studies, and economics and economies of the ancient world, with a PhD in Egyptology from Johns Hopkins University. And she has written also many books, about which we are going to be talking about. First of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about your academic background and your career. So you have an extensive academic background in Egyptology with a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. What initially drew you to the study of ancient Egypt?
It's a strange thing. I think that Egyptologists don't ask each other why they do what they do because they know there's no real answer. That it's that we're all a little mad, a little cracked, a little bizarre, and ancient Egypt usually finds us rather than we finding ancient Egypt, though it's probably a combination of the two. And all I can tell you is that ever since I was a child, I've loved anything ancient, old, dead, gone. And Egypt was always my favorite out of those old and dead cultures, and it has yet to disappoint me. so yeah, I need to know about this ancient place. I don't know why. And I see the world, the present world around me better through the lens of this ancient place. I don't know why. Yeah.
Oh, but I find it interesting that many people that is in love with ancient Egypt, even if they are not Egyptologists, professional Egyptologists, I mean, they have been feeling attracted to ancient Egypt since they were children, and many people has a similar history about their love of towards Egyptology. So it's kind of funny. And as the chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA, how do you see the future of Egyptology evolving?
Oh, that's a tough one, especially today, because we're dealing with a tremendous amount of anti-intellectualism, anti-humanistic thinking, particularly in the United States, authoritarian power. And in many ways, I wrote a whole book about that. And that book is called The Good Kings. And it's called The Good Kings, Absolute Power in Ancient Egypt and the Modern World. And I dare say it was better received in the public than it was within Egyptological circles, though many of my colleagues have reached out and said that they appreciated my words. But that book, The Good Kings, is grappling with what it means to study authoritarian power today and why we are so attracted to authoritarian power today. And I think those as authoritarian power descends upon the United States and Europe and Asia, it's important to ask why authoritarian power makes us feel safe, what the repercussions of it are, who benefits from it. And that includes politically, economically, militarily, ideologically, all of these things. The way I just listed off those politically, militarily, ideological words, I really do rely on the social history of Michael Mann, who separated social history into ideological, economic, military, and political powers. And that helps me to situate myself. And I have since added to that a B for body, so that you come at those powers differently, whether you're in a male body or a female body, a child's body or an adult's body, a body that fits the binary gender norm or a body that doesn't, a disabled body or an able body, an old body or a young body, a healthy body or an unhealthy body. And so that I like to organize categories in that way. And one of the main things that I think differentiates me from most Egyptologists, and I'm not going to say most scholars of the ancient world, because I don't think that's necessarily true, is that well, it might be, is that I try to situate our modern systems into the origination of those systems in the ancient world. And I don't divorce them. I don't separate them. I try not to be anachronistic and to just shove modern conceptions and perceptions onto the ancient world. But I do see the systems that we live within now as having originated around 3500 BCE in Egypt and Mesopotamia and other places, these patriarchal systems, and that we are now inheriting the more complex versions of those systems. We are the descendants of these people, and we are at what I believe to be the most complex and decadent stages of a patriarchy that's reached its last gasps. So those are strong words, but I do situate myself as an Egyptologist within that lineage of watching men hoard and control power, and a small subset of men. Patriarchy is not good for all men. It's good for only a small subset. And then to see that develop with a series of booms and busts through time, getting bigger and bigger as you go. So strangely, I find my interest in Egyptology to be quite worldly, quite pertinent, quite topical, and quite important for the situation we currently find ourselves in.
Fascinating topic and complex, I guess, because as you were saying, that categorization you made, that I understand that can help you classify or categorize again the topic, but is it so easy to draw those borders, those categories, those groups? Because in society, history, culture, those topics are not straight, let's say, or they are not like closed topics. They are very
Yeah.
open. The borders between one aspect and the next are not clear.
Yeah.
So
No,
how is it possible to do that?
yeah, the Michael Mann model it imposes the structure, but it clarifies that there is a bleeding out of each of those influences into another, and that sometimes you don't know where one stops and another starts. You can't have a big army without a lot of funding for it. You can't have, for instance, you can't have a strong church without a tremendous amount of protection of that church. There has to be some sort of military protection, and so on and so forth. So the things are all mutually dependent, but I found it helpful as a social scientist to be able to look for root causes and root destabilizations, and working with that understanding of ideological, economic, military, and political, and playing with it. Like, for instance, I play with it in many different ways. So if I see that Michael Mann talks about military power, when I'm teaching it, I'll say, okay, so look around for military power. It may not present as you expect. It could present as just mere violence, informal violence. When you're in your own household and there's a patriarch who's forcing you to do certain things, you don't think this is military power, but it is in the Michael Mann understanding. It's just in a small domestic sphere in your home. It is an informal, violent version of that military power, but it will have the same effect on you in microcosm that it might in macrocosm. And some of the things that Michael Mann says about military power, that it doesn't have long-term use. Military power is better for short-term use, and it always has a long-term blowback. You'll have the same thing in a small domestic sphere. So if somebody engages in domestic violence, it will have a short-term use, but then long-term there will be repercussions from that. You will lose the hearts and minds of the people you are being violent towards. And then the idea that violent power only has the power to, it can't hold on forever, that there will always be some sort of letting go of that. I work with these things in all different kinds of ways, and it works really well for Egyptology, which is a field that very often takes what the Egyptian elites are giving them as fact for the reason that something is happening, for a battle having been fought, for a king having been chosen. The reasons are given, we accept them, and we don't question or judge them sociologically. And I do like to delve into these things and understand that I'm studying an authoritarian regime that is not and will not give me all of the facts available. They may not even know all of the facts available, the people who are recording this. And so it's up to me as the historian to try to come in as if I am studying any other imperial or authoritarian regime that is keeping its information for itself, for the players on the inside, in the room where it happens. So it's a strange thing. And I've been told, well, how can you know you don't have the evidence for this? This is true, but there are historians in many other fields who know that they can't be in the room where it happens. It was in the past, it wasn't recorded, but they have the circumstantial events of the repercussions that happen after a meeting in a room happen with very important people. And so it's up to us as historians, I feel it's our responsibility to then try to reconstruct how those power systems are working. That makes many people uncomfortable because they say, but you have to use the evidence as given. But then I push back and say, why are you going to believe all of that evidence as it is given to you? I would encourage a much more critical lens of this. I don't see that in Egyptology right now. I see instead an interest in accepting the data as given rather than trying to question and critically examine the data from the perspective of agendas of power. And I would rather do that than not. And I'm in a time in my career where I can. So, but that's not what I see the younger generation necessarily doing, or my generation for that matter.
It must be really difficult because, as you were saying, there are no clear evidences, and the evidences there are questionable, let's say, or it's possible to analyze them from a different point of view, and it involves more criticism, it involves more I don't know how to put it, but yeah, I can imagine it's difficult. For me, I'm an engineer, and I liked the concept you said that you're a social scientist, because I can relate to that, and that's why I also liked the categorization. That word is difficult, sorry. And because I also have that mindset. I need to have everything in order so I can understand it better. I can have a complete picture. So I really like that idea. And to see if I understood what you were saying. So you work with the, let's say, the consequences of the facts that are proved by the evidences available, more or less. Okay, I'm trying to picture it because it must be really difficult, isn't it?
Well, you're really interested in Hatshepsut, for instance, right? So
Yeah.
you take a reign like Hatshepsut and look at the diametrically opposed perspectives on the reign of Hatshepsut. So let me start with this. I've been at the Leiden conference, you mentioned the International Congress of Egyptologists. There was a panel on the future of Egyptology. And at that panel, an older white man looked at me and held the microphone and looked directly at me and said, we cannot connect ancient and modern worlds, and we cannot politicize the ancient world, and we should not politicize the ancient world. So it was a direct critique of that work that I'm doing, right? Now, let's, with the assumption that we don't do this normally, right? But now let's look at Hatshepsut, and you can read some Sir Alan Gardner Hatshepsut history, and you get an idea that Hatshepsut stole the reign of Thutmose III, took it from him wrongfully, and was a usurper and was unsuccessful because he ends up taking it back, right? And then you read Joyce Tildesley, and you have a different perspective, a perspective from the aughts. And you see, oh, she's there coming in as somebody who's saving her dynasty, and without her the 18th dynasty would cease to have existed, right? It wouldn't exist. And so you see that we are indeed politicizing the history that we're writing, but we don't talk about it openly. We don't say, I here in 2005 am writing a history based on my neoliberal feminism that encourages a story like this. Alan Gardner didn't write, I here in 1957 am writing a story based on the patriarchal British structures and private schools that I am a part of, right? But we inherently then as historians know, okay, well, I have to get rid of that Alan Gardner history, but I'm going to go to the Joyce Tildesley history. And then we understand that history is indeed politicized. And so my point with with the history that I'm trying to write is that all history that we're writing is politicized. Every time we study history, it is more about us than it is about the ancient people who are dead and gone and don't care about what it is that we are writing. We're writing it for us. We're writing it for our understanding of where we fit into the human lineage. And given that, we should be open and honest about what it is that we're doing. And will we be able to go into our time machine and figure out exactly what happened with Hatshepsut in 1460 something in our BCE? And no. But can you, understanding that all history is political, understanding that we're viewing it through our own late stage patriarchal lens, look at the circumstances and look at what is not being told and try to piece together a story that is more true to agendas of people in the system and situation in which they existed rather than not. And I, as a historian, think that we can come closer to a truer actual story of the past at the same time that we're also understanding how we politicize history. I think the two go hand in hand. So by politicizing history, I'm not saying, oh my God, you'll never know what happened in the past. To the contrary, I'm saying that by politicizing history today and understanding that it has always been politicized and always will be, that you can have a better understanding with a more critical and circumstantial hypothetical lens of trying to piece together what actually happened. So then you're like, okay, Hatshepsut's there. She has her husband's dead after a few years. It was her brother. And she has this nephew, stepson, and he's been chosen to be king. How has he been chosen to be king? They're saying that the oracle chose him. So it's not a choice of hers necessarily, but having a son who's disconnected to a great family makes him easier to control. For her, well, she's very young. For whom? For which elites? Oh, these elites. And you can piece together a story, a historical narrative that is arguably more true than what the Egyptians themselves are just telling us is what happened. And also more true than what the Egyptians are withholding, because there's a tremendous amount of withholding of knowledge and information. The Egyptians excel at withholding. They don't tell you everything for a purpose. And so you can try to see between the lines and what's not being told. And so I'm always trying to do this with every piece of data that I look at. And I think, again, it's incumbent upon us. It's our responsibility as historians to try to do so. It's one reason I was able to see reuse in data that hardly mentions reuse in a different time period in the late Bronze Age. And if you're only taking the data as written, you won't see it. They're not going to tell you. I reused a coffin today. You have to use all of the available evidence. You have to use the physical coffin and say, oh, look, this has been modified. Why has it been modified? Oh, it's a time of crisis. They don't have wood. They don't have access to this stuff. Okay, so I know that historical economic reality exists. I can see it in the coffin. It's not here in any of the texts. How curious. But, oh, wait a minute. I can look at the text and I can see that almost every price text is for decoration. And there's only, out of like 30 of them, 2 for carpentry. Interesting. Maybe they're pulling coffins out of the ground already formed, and so they don't have to construct them. And so I can then make that argument circumstantially, hypothetically, without the evidence being told to me directly. And I think we're in a time of Egyptological thought in which we're using the data as given, telling ourselves we can't be political, we can't be hypothetical, we have to be scientific, right? Science in many ways has taken over European history writing and European Egyptology. And this is the data that we have, and this is the only data that we have. And there is less historical reconstruction happening that would have been part and parcel of a 1960s, 1970s historian's mind. But we're not allowing it because we're meant to be rigorous scientists. And I think it's a fallacy. I think that hard scientific method, I take the data, this is the data as given to me, this is what the data will tell me, without playing with that data and including some of the experience that's happening around you and the systems around you, not to impose them, but to ask what would a person do in a situation like this, using your information as a human being in complex systems too, which you're going to do anyway, whether you admit it or not. I think that there needs to be more of that play, more of that freedom to mess around. Right now, I see a lot of scarcity mindset, a lot of fear, for good reason. There's no funding. The people who get funding are those with the hardest science proposals. And so people see that and they're like, well, I'm going to go hard science too. But there is no hard science in what it is that we're doing. We're trying to understand what ancient peoples did thousands of years ago. You're going to have to use your own human experience to help you understand that and to play with it. And then maybe make mistakes and then maybe republish and say, oh, I was wrong here. But now I think there could be this or that going on. And I think one last thing, and then I'll let you ask me another question. But I think that Egyptology and humanities in general is so under siege right now that they're trying to pretend that they're science, as if science has all the answers. I'm sorry, but did we not just go through a great pandemic that came up with shit vaccines that didn't work? And we're not allowed to say it. But one vaccine does work and this one doesn't. But science doesn't know all of the answers. Science is not big science with an S. But we in the humanities, in our scarcity mindset, are like, but science with an S. This is what's going to get us the grant. This is what's going to help us figure it out. We're not allowing ourselves to play with the data, to holistically, in a messy human way, try to come up with different permutations for how or why something happened. But instead move from point A to point B to point C with science with a capital S, which I hope people see is not actually a real thing, as so many papers are being retracted from science journals as we speak. And science itself, with its own demands for publication and papers in the scarcity-based world, is also rethinking what science actually is. So we're chasing science when science itself is arguably a problem.
It's a complicated thing. Absolutely. Well, Egyptology itself, it's a difficult field. I don't know if this kind of situation also occurs in other fields of ancient history, or I guess it does, right?
Yeah,
I was
of course.
thinking that I had an interview with Aidan Dodson the other day, and he was explaining to me why it was so important to study the history of Egyptology. And I had never thought about it the way he told me, because he said that it was the only way, and it's completely true and it makes sense, to find out why some ideas or some traditional ideas have been proposed in the first place. So, as you were saying, some theories, hypotheses, some proposals in the past when Egyptology began to exist were done based on the context of the moment as well. So the interpretations that had been done regarding, for example, the houses of Deir el-Medina, the functions of the different spaces that they didn't know, and they still don't know, as far as I know, what they were for. But they interpreted the household, a house in Deir el-Medina, like houses in Victorian era were, because it was the context of the moment. And I think it's very difficult to separate your mindset from your own context to interpret the data, as you were saying. But also there are many different types of resources. It's not only the archaeological evidence, it's the textual evidence, it's the
So
geological
can I just
evidence.
interrupt right there? Can I interrupt?
Yeah,
Like, I
of
would
course.
say that you don't separate. I would say instead that if you are looking at it in the 19th century and saying, oh, wow, they're just like Victorian houses, then you say it directly, that humans in England built these houses in this way. In fact, I live in one, or whatever, and say it directly so that someone else can come along and correct it, add to it, change it. But I don't think it's wrong to say those things or to think them. We live in human bodies in worlds that are going to impose these ideas. There is actually no way of creating a clean vacuum packed separation between you and the ancient world. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. We can't do it. There is no, objective capital O I capital I. It doesn't exist. There's no objective me. So without there being an objective me, then if you're going to bring in analogies and comparisons, be very open about the fact that you're doing it. So somebody can then come in and say, okay, they've done this. I don't think that one's right. Let's change it, or let's add to it, or let's do something else in addition. But being able to see that connection, I think, Aid Dodson's completely right about being able to see that connection. I just think that this 90s new archaeology concept of being able to make a separation and have pure scientific objectivity is a false flag. It's not something that we can actually claim to do. And it's a way of bringing down other people's scholarship that isn't necessarily something that they cannot do themselves.
I guess it's also related to the evolution of Egyptology itself, because maybe there are cases in the past. I'm talking about the beginning of Egyptology, when some ideas that have stuck in time and that we still have them today so embedded in our minds because we have heard them for so long that we just assume they are true. And now, or in recent times, someone is going back to the origin of that concept and double checking why this idea came up, or what were the evidences that there were to draw that conclusion, and so on. So I guess in most cases, nobody said, for example, with the same example as of the houses of Deir el Medina, nobody explained this is how Victorian houses are, so this is what I think they are. It was just kind of understood, implicitly understood, and it was not expressed clearly. It's something that it's analyzed now. So
as long as you're upfront about what it is that you're doing, and you openly state, I am using my own modern biases in this way and applying it, then I agree with you completely. Then the later reader can say, I see. These biases were brought in. I think that accepting that we all have biases and bringing those biases forward to the table as openly and honestly as you can, and saying, these are my biases, this is where I'm coming from, is the best way for anybody to write any history, rather than claiming that you can somehow not have any and that history can be apolitical. I can't agree with that in any way, shape, or form. And the people who say that history can be apolitical are almost always those who are at the tip of the spear of power, whose identity reflects those who are in power or who are in power themselves. So they themselves may not be, strong and in power, but their identity reflects those who are. And so they don't see their perspective as being particularly political. Where things seem more political is when somebody who's on the margins of the accepted power structure are speaking and saying, oh, but it could be this or that. You see this with feminist studies, right? So people who are talking about women and that half of the population, that pesky half of the population, and they're writing as a woman, then somebody might say, oh, well, they're just imposing their female identity, and it's so political, and what they're doing is so political. And then their historical identity as a woman is then wrapped up with everything that they're doing. And much of that history might be thrown out or neglected, but that's not going to happen to the white man of the world, right? A man of color or an Egyptian man studying Egyptians might be perceived as having a particular perspective for Egyptians. That doesn't mean that his history is going to be thrown out. That indeed it will protect that history now more than not, but certainly didn't in 1950, 1940, right? So all I'm saying is that the politics are there. The politics of identity and power are always there. And we should be more open about where we're coming from and what our place in power is as we're working and as we're writing. It's not easy what I'm saying to do. And there's no clear path. It demands play. It demands that we might get some things wrong and have to restate things. That's all right. And overturning assumptions is always there. One Egyptologist who was always very good about overturning assumptions was David O'Connor. he would go out on limbs and say, what, it could be this or it could be that. And he would put it in print and say, this is completely possible. And then he would come along and say, okay, I disagree with what I wrote. I think it's actually this or that. And we don't allow that much anymore, if at all. We demand that you have your scientific hypothesis, you come up with your methodology, you have your theoreticians who are supporting it, that you prove it, and then you publish it, and there's no retraction of that conclusion. And I would argue for some more humanistic play of how people were in the ancient world and how systems function.
I think admitting one's our own mistakes, it's kind of a good thing in any space of life, not only in Egyptology, but in general. And also maybe a theory or an hypothesis you come up with when you're younger, it's not the same as one you might have when you're older. You have more experience, you have developed your ideas, you have seen more things, so and you are more creative maybe, so it's kind of normal to maybe revisit your own ideas and maybe not change them in all cases, but or maybe yes, or just modifying something or giving more details or just I don't know. I think it's a positive thing. It's in general. But yeah, Egyptology again, an academic world also, it's a very complicated thing, and the fans. So in the end, both in history and also in current times, the context is very complicated economically, socially, politically.
Yeah.
So absolutely. And what about your books? You have written many books, and one of them is The Woman Who Would Be King and When Women Ruled the World, focus heavily on female power in ancient Egypt. What inspired you to explore this topic in the first place?
It's funny because I didn't want to write the Hatshepsut book, and I was luckily I luckily had a literary agent come to me and say that he wanted me to write a book about Hatshepsut. And I had the temerity to say that I didn't want to write a book about Hatshepsut, that I didn't even do that work. She did 18th dynasty. She was 18th dynasty, and I did the 19th and 20th. And he rolled his eyes and said, why wouldn't you want to write a book on women in power? And it's an interesting thing because that conversation tells you everything that you need to know about how the academic world works, right? We put ourselves in these silos and these boxes. I told him as a young scholar, there's no way I could write about Hatshepsut. They'll kill me. I do the 19th and 20th dynasty. She's 18th. How dare I even think that I could do something like that? What am I going to relearn this whole dynasty, et cetera, et cetera? And he came back at me with, you silly thing. Why wouldn't you try to attack this very, very interesting question? Yeah, learn some things about the 18th dynasty, learn some things about her reign. And so I had to realize that I was being very academically fearful, as our training encourages us to do, to stay in our boxes, to stay in our silos, not just in time, but in style. And I ended up writing a book that surprised me as well, because that book, it attempts to look at Hatshepsut from beginning to end to afterlife, with the question there being what really happened and how can we even say what really happened, and trying to hypothetically reconstruct what really happened. So it was very much an experiment trying to do that. I didn't expect to pick that book up, but I was made to by a literary agent. So in some ways, Hatshepsut found me, right? Whether I wanted to take that on or not. And then the same is true for the second book, When Women Ruled the World. I moved book imprints from Random House. I moved to Nat Geo Books, National Geographic Books. And my book editor there, Hilary Black, said, I'd love for you to write a comparative history of different Egyptian women rulers. And I thought, oh, that's a great topic. Okay. So it was Hilary who gave me that topic. So both of those books, in a sense, came to me not from my own thoughts and imaginations and, oh, I really should do this, but they came to me from people who said, this is what we want from you. And that's I don't know, it's an interesting way of going about things as an academic. It's not the way that academics usually do things. They look at, I suppose, what hasn't been done, where there's a hole in the scholarship, where people haven't put as much attention. But in this case, it was two people saying, we would like you to write this book. And I said, yes. Instead of saying no, there was a big part of me that really wanted to say no. It would have been much safer to say no, but instead I said yes. And we get the books that are out there today. Yeah.
Ask if you regretted that decision? I don't think so.
Oh no, not at all.
So.
Not at all. No. It's funny whenever I'm invited to be a part of, when you're invited to be to write a book chapter, a part of an edited volume, and the edited volume, people are like, oh, we're working on it from this perspective. We want you to look at this from that perspective. And every time I'm like, oh, I hadn't thought of it from this perspective. How interesting. For instance, John Papadopoulos and Gary Urton invited me to work on their edited volume on value. And they said, oh, we'd like you. And they misunderstood that I work on bodies instead of coffins. I don't work on bodies, right? That's somebody who's a bioarchaeologist who works on mummification and biological preservation. I work on the coffins, and I'm an art historian, and I look at the prices for those coffins and all of these things. This is some 20 years ago. And they asked me to write about the value of the body. And I knew it was a misunderstanding, that they misunderstood the coffin and the body and all of these things. But I thought, what is the value of a mummified, crafted body? And as soon as that idea went into my head, then I started to think about it, and I had the ideas for the paper and then the idea for the article. But I think that these things are all around us, these invitations, these synchronicities, these things where people are like, we want you to write this. And I do like to listen to those little cues rather than over curate my life. I've seen people around me say, no, I am not meant to do this. I said I was going to do this in my 5-year plan, and do it I shall. And I don't keep to those 5-year plans. I keep to them a bit, but like, I'm often meandering and saying, oh, okay, this project's going to go to the side for now, and I'm going to work on this one because this seems to be what people are more interested in from me for right now, for whatever reason. And so a lot of the reason that I end up writing what I write is because I'm asked to write it. And it takes a lot of the pressure off of me. It's kind of like the Oracle, right? Who is going to be king next? Who's going to be king next? Will they hold it up, and then do they get drunk or high or whatever? They decide to point it in that direction, and then that's the guy who's going to be king next. Okay. Do they make the decision beforehand together? Don't know. But it's a communal decision, and somebody else, the Oracle is a way of shifting the responsibility to somebody else. And in a sense, it's a blessing to say, oh, well, yeah, I shifted to this thing because I had to do it at this time. It's the same for my book, Recycling for Death. I published the last part of the coffins that I looked at for reuse first because the Cairo Museum demanded, with their copyright rules, that I publish them right away. So I did, because that was what they needed me to do. So in many ways, I'm just like, okay, what do you guys need? Who needs what? You need that? You need this? And that seems to be a way of managing my career rather than a hard curation of what my expectations are.
But it sounds more fun like this. I think it's more challenging, and I think I would like to be approached in that way, like, because it would mean getting out of my comfort zone, and that's something I like. So I think it's very interesting. Sorry?
One thing I always tell my students is, don't try to curate your life. Just say yes to everything that you're asked to do, until really, like, say yes to everything. And some things are going to be mistakes. Some things are going to be like, oh, I shouldn't have said yes to that. And at some point, you're going to have so much that you've said yes to that you're going to have to start saying no to things. And some things will become more heavy so that you can't focus on this or that. And you just kind of let the circumstances of life take over. And that has worked really well for me so far.
You only live once. Yeah. And if you have opportunities that are interesting for whatever the reason, do you want to go to live in Belgium? Yes. Of course. Do you want to go to Egypt?
Yes, and
everything turned out really well. It's also a matter of luck, but I think life is like that, and if you have opportunities or chances to do something original, just embrace it and enjoy it.
And it means that you will have those moments in life where you're doing three things at the same time. And you're like, what have I done to myself? This is ridiculous. And that's just a time you have to get through. And you have an overabundance of material to work through. There will be times when you don't have anything. And you're like, wow, there's nothing going on. What's happening? But just you just have to deal with the overabundance, and your body and your mind will tell you where you have to stop at some points. But saying yes at least gives you all of the opportunities lined up so that you can sweep some things. You only have one mind and one body. You can't do everything at the same time, but at least it gives you all of the opportunities
Yeah,
at one
absolutely.
moment.
I've decided not to stress out anymore, but during COVID times, I studied two masters at the same time while having a full-time job.
Oh my
So
God.
that was intense for 2 years or a bit more. So, and more now it's more or less like this, but I've decided not to stress, go step by step and do one thing at a time, and that's it. That's the only thing you can do. But I like that approach of doing this kind of books that have been asked for you. And but do you have your own projects or some topics that you would really like to work on and you haven't had the chance to, or it's something that it's in the back of your brain, like, okay, I have to do this sometime. I have more important things to do now, or I have this or that. But some kind of project, dream
Yeah.
project.
So I always try to keep a kind of double personality, if you like. So there's the part of me, the half of me. Sometimes that it's 70% and 30%, sometimes it's less, depends. But there's always that half of me that's doing the things that other people are asking me to do, whether it's a book chapter or a trade book or something like that, a podcast, whatever. And then there's the other half of me that's trying to follow a long-term scholarly trajectory. And I know as a scholar that I need to have that. That's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because there are questions that I really want to know the answers to. So that scholarly trajectory, it also found me. My coffin prices in my first book, The Cost of Death, which was my dissertation, about how much coffins cost, how they're valued, how they're created, where they're created, what kind of pigments are used, all of those questions, art historical and economic. It was my first year of graduate school. I gave a presentation and Betsy Bryan said, this should be your dissertation. And I said, no way. I'm not going to do a dissertation with all these prices and numbers. It's so economic. I have to really delve into the economics of the ancient world. I don't want to do that. That scares me. And so I said, no. And then 2 years later, I'm like, okay, fine. So I write that dissertation, which then is published as a book in 2007. It takes a long time to get the dissertation to a book. And that trajectory of scholarship of 20th to 21st dynasty now and 22nd dynasty funerary arts and value and cost and now reuse and recycling, I keep following where that thread that weaving, that tapestry I'm weaving, where it leads to. And I keep following that. So there are times when I've published a big thing like Recycling for Death, right? That's a big book that I've published. And now I have to sit back and go, okay, well, where does my scholarly trajectory go next? And there I do have to curate. I have to sit down and think about it and go, okay, what am I going to do next? I know what the popular subjects are that I'm working on. I know what trade book I'm going to do next. And I've got that going. But what scholarly trajectory do I always have to keep running so that I have the development of myself as a thinker? Not that I'm not thinking in trade books, but it's a different pattern. It's a different kind of work. And I do have the idea for that. And there's going to be a lot more co-publishing involved, a lot more work with younger scholars, because it's boring to just work with me. So I'm going to bring in a lot more. That's why I published the Egyptian Society book with Danny Candelora and Carrie Arbuckle McLeod, because those women were both students of mine and now are peers of mine, but a generation below me. And I learned from them as much as they learned from me. So I think that's where my scholarly trajectory will go next. And I am working on a second volume of Recycling for Death, but this time with a co-author, Kylie Thompson. So that's where I think I get, when you lack enthusiasm, then you have to be like, okay, I'm lacking enthusiasm. Why? Why don't I want to do it? Oh, because it's lonely and sad and I don't want to do all this alone. Well, I could do it with somebody else. Who would I want to do it with? Oh, okay. And then I see a new trajectory that's more interesting to me, that that brings the spark back into what I'm doing. So I do have a self curation in a sense, and every scholar needs to. And I think my case is particularly tricky because it's very easy for people to say, oh, Kara Cooney, she's a popularist. We can discount her entirely. She just does this, this stuff for the masses and she has no rigor. And knowing that, I have to then say, okay, well, here's the rigorous side of me. I do musings of what history is and how ancient people may have thought or acted or been, and you may reject that, but here's another side to my work that will be harder to reject. And I play with both sides of me, trying to prioritize one, prioritize the other, depending on different times. But both are very mutually dependent upon the other. So it's interesting to see that myself in my own, now 30 years later, right? 30 years on from when from when I started my PhD work.
I think it's also necessary to have these two faces of the coin, like because the academic publications are so strict and you need to follow the rules and you need to follow the certain steps and certain standards that are very strict and tough. So because I've heard many Egyptologists comment something similar, like when they do books for dissemination just for the general public, it's very relaxing and they enjoy a lot because it allows them to play, to play a bit more with ideas, to play a little bit more with maybe proposing a different idea that they would never or that they wouldn't do initially in an academic environment. But this other more public sphere allows you Egyptologists in general to relax a bit and maybe create new ideas that when you go back to the academic sphere, maybe you develop, but when you free your mind, you can be more creative, maybe.
Yeah.
And I also think it's interesting. I think it's very enriching because you have other perspectives, other opinions from someone else about the same topic, about how to face an issue. And I think it's always
Yeah.
very positive, or most of the time, it's very positive to count on someone else to do a job or to have a project. And
Yeah.
in the other book you mentioned before, in The Good Kings, you examine absolute power in ancient Egypt and its modern parallels. What lessons can contemporary societies learn from ancient Egyptian leadership?
So much. So much. I think for now, I'll leave it by saying that the seeds of the collapse are sown when the system is its most wealthy, its most baroque, but also its most socially unequal. And I think that we can see that today very clearly. We can see it in certain nation states. We can certainly see it in that most powerful nation state, the United States of America. Where I am right now in Los Angeles, it's often called the home of the homeless, and it's called that for a reason. And you can see the extraordinary inequality all around you, extraordinary asymmetricality of wealth distribution, however that wealth goes into certain people's hands. And so the good kings and those systems of old teach us that these systems are unsustainable and they will always collapse. They always do. And Egypt is that gift of 3,000 years of ups and downs where you can see the collapses. In the United States, we're in a system that's existed for 250 years, maybe 400 if you count when the first chattel enslaved people were brought over to the United States. Maybe a little bit longer when the first genocide of the indigenous peoples of this country began. But you can see that the collapse is inevitable, and it's hard to see from inside of the collapse. So from the perspective of collapse studies, Egypt is the gift that keeps giving, because you're able to see, oh, okay, this system, and there's no pinpointing one thing. It's not the long reign of Pepi II, right? It's the long reign of Pepi II with the social inequality, with the moving of resources here or there, with the whatever it is, with drought and famine and other things that will then cause the toppling of centralized power. And then you can look at what people do in the first intermediate period to survive that crisis and collapse. And you learn that the first 100 years, maybe 50 years of a collapse are always the worst. And then people find like some sort of mechanism of negotiation and adaptation to the new normal. And then you see within that post-acute collapse situation, extraordinary opportunity for creativity and building new things. You see decentralization, you see shared power, you see different kinds of systems. You don't see as much display. You don't see wealth being pulled towards the display of one great man here or there. But it'll come back. It always does, right? In with patriarchal systems. And then they pull back to an 11th dynasty when the great men start to have their hoarded resources that they pulled from others that they can then use to show their social separation, and the game begins again, right? So watching that happen over, which we all do as Egyptologists, over 3,000 years is sobering, to be sure, but and each time something collapses, it's rebuilt bigger each time, arguably, right? After ancient Egypt up to the present day. And I talk about that in the last chapter. And I talk about how we're now at a finite end stage because the earth won't allow humanity to grow anymore. 8.5 billion people, where are we going to go from here? We can't do 10 billion and then 20 billion, and the planet can't sustain itself. That's why in the United States, you have the great men now saying, we need to go to the national parks. We need to go to the national forests. We're going to drill. We're going to take the trees. We're going to do the things from these protected places because it's the last place left, right? Or they're going to go to the moon, or they're going to go to Mars, or whatever it is that they're going to go because there's no space left. And the system itself now, I think, is breaking. This whole patriarchal system that we've created of hoarded wealth and the display thereof, and the social separations and the inequality, the control of women, and the creation of masses of a population through those women who are treated as chattel cattle. I think we're reaching the ends of that. And we as humanity are now figuring out where we fit. I'm using Egypt to help myself understand, and I hope other people understand where we fit in this great scheme of things. And I find that a very useful and helpful and comforting place to go as a historian. It helps me in many ways to see what's coming, and it helps me to prepare for it emotionally, not necessarily prepare for it physically, because there's a lot that one can't do, but to understand that it's in community that we will find our way through this situation that we have built for ourselves, and to see the opportunity in it rather than to freak out and go all Mad Max and assume that, because Mad Max, that kind of apocalypse, is exactly what the patriarchy wants you to think is going to happen. That we're eating people and milking women, and I don't know if you've seen these films, but but that's the kind of apocalypse the patriarchy wants to present. Those Hunger Games, that Ipuwer kind of understanding of the world, right? Or Ankh Tifi, people are eating people kind of thing. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but if it did, it's for a short period of time. It's not a consistent thing. But that kind of fear-mongering is exactly what will keep us listening to our authoritarian leaders and doing what they say. So it's kind of like a prognostication tool, this history that we've chosen for ourselves, right? So we might as well use it as such rather than not, and quit sternly admonishing each other for trying to use history to see what's going to come next. I think we can.
And your latest book, Recycling for Death, explores coffin reuse, as you were saying before, and the Theban royal caches. What does this practice tell us about ancient Egyptian society, beliefs, and economy?
Oh yes. So this is I have the book right next to me, right here. Great big beast of a
Show
book.
us.
Yeah. I had to cut it down because
Yeah.
Miriam Fahmy, the editor-in-chief of AUC Press, was like, it won't fit in the binding. You have to make sure that you can fit when they sew the binding in China so that it'll fit together. And so I cut it, and I'm very proud of the book. I'm so thrilled and relieved that it's out. But it is essentially trying to understand the late Bronze Age collapse through a particular cache of coffins. And it's a strange thing to say, okay, as I'm writing the book, I'm like, oh my God, I'm trying to understand the Bronze Age collapse through coffins. But why not? Why not use this data? And why not use the texts that are dealing with reuse and crisis and other things? And I do look at the tomb robbery papyri, the strike papyri, the late Ramessid letters, price texts from Western Thebes about funerary arts and such things. But I also look at the material culture itself and look at how it was modified and reused and by people in extraordinary positions of power who had control over all of Upper Egypt and had control over the biggest bank vault in the world at the time in the Valley of the Kings, where just tons of gold and silver were kept in perpetuity over hundreds of years until they were systematically removed and used to fund a regime over hundreds of years. You learn from that what goes in must come out in some way, that there is no free lunch, as we say in the United States. There's no way of burying a king in state and expecting that material to go in there and stay forever. Even Tutankhamun must pay his bills, right? So Tutankhamun got to stay in there until 1922. And now what does Tutankhamun do? He works for a living. He's there entertaining tourists till the end of time. So there is no way to keep this material wealth to yourself for forever. Everyone else will consume it at some point eventually. And I find that very interesting that the rich people today, like Mark Zuckerberg or whatever, they have their Hawaiian compounds and their vaults underneath their homes. They'll be safe from all the hordes coming to get them. No one ever will be. You will always be brought back into the community whence you came, and your goods and yourself, you'll always be pulled back into the larger human scheme of things. So to watch these wealthy humans socially separate themselves over centuries, and to do so through material wealth and material display, and to have it function, but then to have that crisis hit where people can't get access to new wood in particular, and to have those very pieces that they use to say, I am a god unlike you, taken out of the ground and used for other wealthy people who need to do the same thing. It's very interesting to then watch those wealthy people over the generations decide not to change, decide to say, no, I'm going to keep burying myself with as much over the top, or maybe not as much, but with extraordinary wealth and gilded pieces and all of these things. I'm going to still display, but I'm going to recycle the generation before me to be able to do that display. So you can see the wealthy people trying to keep that game going and not giving it up until they are absolutely made to give it up. And they arguably never gave it up and still haven't given it up. But those things do keep, they're pulled back into the economy in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, there's a lot to learn about collapse and just the way that rich people think. I mean that very, very basically. How do rich people think? They don't think, oh, this is a system that's falling apart, I should fix it. They think, oh, this is a system that's falling apart, how do I make sure that I'm not touched by it? And that's the way they're still thinking, right? That's the way they were thinking thousands of years ago. That's the way they're still thinking today. And people only change when they absolutely have to change. And I would argue that they didn't have to change in the 21st or 22nd or even 23rd, 24th, 25th dynasties, that we're now finally being asked to change. And so it's interesting to see that trajectory come all the way to this point in human time.
Yeah, forced by the circumstances. Ancient Egypt allowed women to rule at certain points in history, but power was still largely male-dominated. How did female pharaohs like Hatshepsut navigate this system?
Well, they use the patriarchy. That's why my book, When Women Ruled the World, is very much a tragedy. And why, when I was writing it, one of my sub-editors said, well, this is depressing. No one's going to want to read this. I'm like, I'm not going to write it such that these women ruling changed anything, because it didn't. Yes, Egypt was the only place in the ancient world where women were able to reach the top of the pyramid of social power, if you want to even frame it that way. They ruled as nothing less than king 5 times. That's extraordinary. You don't get that in ancient Italian peninsula, ancient Greece, ancient Syria, ancient, you don't have that in other places. You might have that in some places in the ancient world, like China. I think China would be the best comparison. But China and Egypt, those women who were able to get to those high positions of power knew they had to act within and acted within patriarchal systems, because that's what was available to them. They didn't create anything that was different from the patriarchal system. They couldn't. And so when a woman reaches a high level of power, it's not because she's been such a good woman. It's because she's been such a good woman subsuming herself to patriarchal systems. I'm not trying to discount all the amazing women in power today. I think that we're now reaching an anti-patriarchal moment in which people are trying to, women and men, are trying to push against those systems. But in the ancient world, a woman in power had to be just as violent as a man, had to go to war. She wasn't more pacific just because she was a woman. She had to work with her body to produce offspring if that served her, like Cleopatra. If she was past childbearing age, then she had to change her body ideologically. Like Hatshepsut, she had to masculinize and pretend that female body didn't exist in a sense, and somehow ideologically shift it. She knew that a woman who ruled for a long period of time knew that she couldn't rule alone, that a woman who ruled alone was eliminated in some way or passed over, or the power went to somebody else very quickly, without it being handed off to somebody in her lineage, because biologically it's hard for a woman to create a number of heirs that come from her own body because she produces it in her body. Within patriarchy, women are exploited as the producers of the future generation, and as such, they are commoditized. They are marked and named as the one who is bearing the next thing, but that gift of being able to bear that child makes them into a commodity rather than making them into someone with power. And a woman had to negotiate that. Just look at Catherine the Great for how a woman had to negotiate that childbearing, or look at Elizabeth I for a woman in the pre-modern world who had to negotiate not having children at all, purposefully, not marrying at all, because that would have taken her power away. And the amount of negotiation that a woman must make within a patriarchal system is mind-numbing. And it turns one into a pretzel trying to figure out how they went through these machinations of figuring out how to situate themselves within the system. And each one of these women relied on an entourage of courtiers who were men who helped them to negotiate that system that they were a part of. And it was useful to that entourage, to those courtiers, to have that woman in that place at that time. When it wasn't useful to them anymore, they removed her. And they often removed her from the history books at the same time. And you can see that for somebody like Mère Neith, going back 5,000 years, you can see that she's in the history books of her day, a king list that's found in the tomb of her son, King Den. But then a few generations later, she's been removed. The king's mother, Mère Neith, is no longer in the king's list. You don't need her anymore. In fact, it's destabilizing for the pure lineage of that king list. So you remove her. And it's the same for Hatshepsut. She's useful in the moment, in the short term. She's necessary in the moment, in the short term. And then in the long term, she has to be excised. And you don't see her in in Seti the First's Abydos relief of the king list. She can't be there. So it's a double-edged sword playing with patriarchy as a female ruler. And my next trade book will indeed be asking more such questions as I look at the very difficult situation of Nefertiti and who Nefertiti was, how she found her way to power, or how she was placed into power, and what power means through a woman's lifetime. Because we as historians are often seeing things through a patriarchal lens of male gets power, this is it. When a woman gets power, that power develops through her lifetime. If she can have children early, if she can't have children later, her crone years, men don't have to deal with these crone years the way that women do, changes how a woman's power is not only perceived, but how it's actionable. And I'm interested in working through those questions with Nefertiti, because I do believe that she was Smenkare. And I think there's evidence to suggest that she was Smenkare. It's not a question of belief, right? That these throne names don't just get thrown around. And the name Ankh-Khepru-Re is a throne name that is consistent and used for Nefer-Neferu-Aten and used for Smenkare. So I do think that it's the same person. I don't think it's madness to think that it's the same person. And the fact that you can't see her or find her is exactly in keeping with how women had to rule within patriarchal structures. So I'm continuing on this trajectory of female power and what it means and how it works, how complicated it is, how this is not a romantic, matriarchal winning. This is very much a tragedy and almost always ends in some sort of a crisis for the woman and for the entourage around
her. And do you think moral perceptions of female power have changed significantly compared to those in ancient Egypt?
No. I don't know. I think that we can create systems in which women have a better shot of getting into power. And I think parliamentary systems are one mechanism for that in a democracy. Democracy is a flawed system, but parliamentary systems allow a community to choose their own representative, and that representative can sometimes be chosen as head of state. It's because there's no direct choice of the people. I argue in many circumstances that women are allowed to find power as head of state. Women only find power as head of state in parliamentary systems. Women never find power in direct democratic elections where people are voting directly for a president. People living in patriarchal systems don't like women in power. That's not to say that women aren't successful as leaders in democratic systems, but that there is still an extraordinary distrust, perceived duplicitousness, perceived problematic nature of women, however you understand that people are not interested in. I think you can see it everywhere. I think you can see it in history. I think you can see how we judge a male historian versus a female historian, how much leeway and flexibility to play we give the male historian versus the female historian. It's the same with leadership. How much flexibility to make mistakes or to have issues in their rule, male versus female. If I see it changing, and there is change, because I do think that we're going through an anti-patriarchal movement. I think that change is happening on the grassroots, and I think it's happening bottom up. It's happening not necessarily top down. And it is happening in places that impose structural equality between the sexes and non-binary peoples. And those places would be Northern European countries, Iceland. Iceland has more female rulers. Let's look at Iceland and see what it is that they're actually doing. I think it often finds its form in places that have been through war, where men have been killed or are absent for whatever reason. And you see more women come to the fore. I think Rwanda in the last 100 years has been an example of such female power. but if we continue to rule and govern in the neoliberal, I don't care if it's democratic, we continue to govern in this oligarchic way that we have globally in Europe, the United States, and Asia, everywhere, South America, it doesn't matter. Then women will continually be seen as commodities to be controlled and owned, objectified, and not seen as leaders. And I think we need to return to different sustainable indigenous styled systems for women to find that kind of power. And I think we see glimmers of it, but I don't think we see it, except in a place like Iceland, systematically represented in neoliberal democracies and communist states, in fascist oligarchies, or in autocratic regimes of any other kind, or military regimes. I don't think we see it. I think right now it's very much a man's world. And that doesn't mean that a lot of those men aren't feminist and in favor of women's rights and women's self-autonomy. But a lot of the time it doesn't. I grew up in Texas, so I think that's
context also has some influence. Well, I have some more questions, but I'm thinking that maybe we can have another interview in the future so we can discuss maybe your next book or something, and we continue talking, because it's been quite a long interview already, and I want to let you rest, recover. But I've seen you okay. I haven't seen you too sick, so I'm happy that to see that you're more or less okay.
I have my little herbal stick, so I was able to keep it going with my eucalyptus, and that's good. Yeah.
Thank you very much for making this effort, being sick and being here with us for such a long time. And well, I hope to see you soon. Let's keep in touch and discuss further the rest of my questions and your next book and whatever you want to discuss with us. We are always going to welcome you in the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you so much.